Well, let's get started. I'm glad to be back. I had to suffer through Los Angeles for a whole week last week, going to various meetings I had to do. I want to point out, and we'll tell again to the rest of the class when they get here, that this coming Thursday, in light of the fact that the Mueller report is going to be released or made public at about 4 o'clock Eastern time, just before Good Friday and the long weekend, with Congress all being out on vacation. That means that we'll get it here at about 1 o'clock. And so I'll get it, our people will pull it down, and I'll be able to go through it. And we'll be discussing the Mueller report on Thursday, because the way that the class is going to go is we're going to be interweaving the data about global climate change, which you got a lot of from John this past Tuesday and Thursday, along with the unfolding story of the impeachment and how they're related and how they relate to global climate change and the uprising of the indigenous people around North America against the pipelines that are being increased dramatically. So that's what we're going to be doing. So I want to, in light of the fact that it's coming sort of hot off the presses on Thursday, I'll take that up directly when it starts on Thursday. Okay, but today we're going to be turning from the details of global climate change and the scientific data that backs it, which is, multitudinous, that data that you saw. And the advantage is that since we have all of these classes videotaped, you can go back and look at the videotape, and you can actually get to go through a lot of the graphs and the details that John had here. So it wasn't intended, I don't want you to panic, it isn't intended that you've memorized those charts yet. No, you're not going to have to do that. But we're going to today we're going to turn our attention to the politics of global climate change, and we're going to be starting to, at least at the very beginning here, start to discuss the climate change deniers in their arguments versus the people who are sort of the champions of the anti-global climate change movement around the planet. And there's some examples of some of these climate deniers that we could spend a lot of time going through a lot of their really inane comments. But I just want to share a few of them with you at the beginning. In the face of all of the evidence that you saw last Tuesday and Thursday that John Conway presented to you, you have people like Senator James Inhofe. James Inhofe is the Oklahoma senator who chairs the United States Senate Committee on the Environment and Public Works. And he has, in the company of the rest of the people in this administration, like Donald Trump and Scott Pruitt, who is also from Oklahoma, was the Attorney General from Oklahoma, big oil state. And Pruitt had been made by Trump to be the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. And Pruitt, in his career as the Attorney General of Oklahoma, had filed numerous lawsuits against the Environmental Protection Agency, asserting that they didn't have the power or the authority to be promulgating the rules that they were doing. And of course, this is a huge oil state dominated by the Kerr-McGee Petroleum Corporation. And the Kerr of Kerr-McGee is Robert S. Kerr, who was the 8-time congressman from Oklahoma, and later on he was the 4-time governor of Oklahoma, and then the senator from Oklahoma who chaired the Senate Armed Services Committee. And that's the kind of power that the Kerr-McGee Petroleum Corporation has over the state of Oklahoma. And that Scott Pruitt, the Attorney General, being the mouthpiece for the oil industry, had confronted the Environmental Protection Agency repeatedly and has been made the head of it by Donald Trump. And of course, you're all aware of the fact that Rick Perry, who was the former governor of Texas, has been made the head of the Energy Secretary, the Department of Energy. And I don't know if you guys ever saw it, but when he was running for the presidency back in 2008, he listed out a number of the major agencies that he was planning to shut down. And there were 3 of them. And one of them, he said, was the Department of Education. And then another one was, and he started trying to guess, the one he forgot was, in fact, the Department of Energy. And now he has been made the head of the Department of Energy, which he has vowed to shut down. And what he's doing is basically turning around and promulgating massive development of oil and petroleum. He, in fact, is the vice president of Sunoco Logistics, one of the partners in the Energy Transfer Partners Corporation that is building the Dakota Access Pipeline. And of course, there is, in fact, Rex Tillerson, who was the original Secretary of State. We touched upon that earlier in the early lectures, but as the Secretary of State, he, in fact, had been given the highest award ever given to a non-Russian by the Russian government for his having crafted a potential contract between ExxonMobil and the Russian government for developing the petroleum resources in the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. And so that this group of people that are dominating the administration have as a major ally in the United States Senate, Senator James Inhofe. And Inhofe, as I said, has said such sterling things as the global climate change campaign is nothing but a political machine sending out its partisan snake oil salesmen, misleading the American public regarding their purely political agenda under the mere guise of trying to protect the environment. And he said that it is the natural variability of the climate that is really going on here, not anything caused by fossil fuel emissions. And he said the satellite data has confirmed, and balloon measurements confirm, that there's no meaningful warming that has occurred at all over the past century. He just sort of says it in the face of all of the contrary evidence that you've seen. And without going on and on about these bizarre things that he says and these other people say, he actually states that no one has seriously demonstrated any scientific proof that increased global temperatures will cause any kind of adverse consequences as are predicted by the alarmists. In fact, it appears that exactly the opposite is true, that these increases in global temperatures will actually have a beneficial effect upon the way that people live on the planet. So you can see that they just go on and on like this, but the fact of the matter is that the back and forth on these things, here's all the scientific evidence in support of global climate change, here are all these kind of inane, kind of apodictic statements that are being made by Trump and the Republican leadership that it's not happening, that it's a hoax perpetrated by China to undermine our industrial base, all of these other rather ludicrous things that they say. All of this is just introductory to what's really going on here. And what we're dealing with in this course is what is really going on here. That what we want to maintain here in this course, and we want you to become familiar with the data that supports this thesis, And that is that ever since the end of World War I, basically in 1918, there has been going on the planet this major dialectical struggle, kind of a bipolar struggle that's been going on. And it hasn't been really just the United States government versus the Soviet Union in the long-time Cold War. It has been, in fact, something more long-lasting. It, in fact, has been a continuation of the effort on the part of the robber barons in the United States that rose to power in the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War, rose to power over a very short span of approximately 30 years, from the end of the American Civil War in 1868 to 1898. These people rose into a position of power, engined primarily by the creation of a new type of business vehicle. And this was the private shareholder-owned corporation. And what happened is at the end of the Civil War, the major northern industrialists and the financial managers of the major urban areas in the north began to get their corporate lawyers appointed to the federal judgeships. And these federal judges, over a period of time between 1868 and in 1880, a fairly short period of time, what they did is they promulgated an entire doctrine that corporations were, in fact, people. That a corporation was a person, that the corporation had the same fundamental constitutional rights that an individual person had. And then they waged war from that position, insisting that the government, state or federal, could not, in fact, regulate the corporations to keep the corporations from doing a whole series of things they were doing, such as polluting the rivers, pumping all of the waste materials from manufacturing into the rivers, polluting the air, monopolizing entire areas of the economy, such as the railroads, the steel mills, the agricultural field, all of these major area, textile mills, these were all being monopolized by a handful of some 24 to 40 or so major robber barons that became quite famous in American history as robber barons. There has been an attempt of late, basically since the election of Ronald Reagan back in 1980 up until now, there's been an effort to revisit that entire history and to change the national view of the robber barons. There was a major campaign to change the textbooks in the United States from referring to the robber barons and having them called the captains of industry. You'll see it actually if you go to the Wikipedia page. Interesting, you go to the Wikipedia page on robber barons, and you'll see how the corporations have wangled their way into Wikipedia, in that they've kind of inserted into any kind of the sites they have there that these are older views. This viewing of the robber barons as somehow adverse to the public interest, that they were somehow unfair or unethical, is kind of been eclipsed with newer thinking. But the fact of the matter is, this dynamic has been going on, the rise of the robber barons, since the very end of the American Civil War, because, and I had touched upon it in the early lecture or two, that the school books have taught the American studentry that the Civil War was fought because of slavery. That the North, being more elevated and educated and intelligent, thought that slavery was a really bad idea. And the people in the South, being kind of backwards and uneducated and slave owners living on plantations, that rose up and rebelled against the United States government because they wanted to keep slavery. And somehow the Northern heroes were there to do away with slavery. Well, the fact of the matter is, slavery was not outlawed by the federal government until way into the Civil War. The Civil War had already been going on, and really the more sophisticated analysis of history shows that the conflict that broke out into the American Civil War really was incipient from the very beginning, because I want to talk to us today about this, that this confrontation that I'm talking about, this dialectical struggle that has been going on in earnest since the end of World War I, that is a white, male-driven, nation-state-based, elitist-led, corporate, capitalist, imperial venture. Basically, the quest to establish full-spectrum dominance over the planet through its economic hegemony and military hegemony. And their objectives were to capture the instrumentalities of the state, of the United States government, to do their bidding, to basically open markets all through South America, for example. And they waged this war with the support of the people in Congress because the major corporations were paying for their campaigns, just outrightly, publicly, delivering huge, bags full of cash to the Senate in House campaigns. And that was going on all during the robber baron era. And that movement has never stopped. And in fact, it was, as I said, there from the beginning. And I want to just touch upon it. This isn't exactly just a history class. Those I pointed out, those of you who are history majors, can in fact get credit for this course by going and talking to the heads of the history department, and that they will give you permission probably for getting full credit towards your major here in this. But history is extraordinarily important in trying to understand what it is that's happening today. And that is, as I'm saying, happening today. We'll talk on Thursday. Here comes the Mueller report. Here's the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives digging into the report to try to find information that shows that Donald Trump has been using the instrumentalities of the state to enrich himself, that he's a fraud, that he has got compromised business relationships with Russia, and this major dynamic that's going on in our lives right now. If when you go home tonight, when you get done with your studies, and you turn on MSNBC News to watch the news, or you turn on CNN, or you turn on any one of the national news shows, I guarantee you, within 1 minute, you're going to start hearing the talk about this thing, about the fact that the Mueller report's coming out, the fact that the Democrats in Congress are trying to figure out a way to impeach Trump. That's going to hit you right in the face. And there's going to be at least one or more other stories about the consequences of global climate change. They're going to show the reservations underwater up in South Dakota, and the other 85% of the counties in Nebraska. They're going to show, potential massive storms coming in to, blow out Texas or Florida or others, that you're going to see these two stories sort of dominating. And you will, within the very near future, as summer comes on, you're going to start seeing more and more stories about the uprisings against the pipelines that they're trying to build all through Middle America. They're trying to suck the oil out of North Dakota and the southern Canada and pump it out all the way down through the country, down to the Gulf of Mexico, or to the Pacific, with regard to the Canadian pipeline, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, so they can ship it out and sell it to foreign countries, not to supply any kind of energy needs or for our country at all. So all of this posturing about it being super patriotic to support the building of these oil pipelines is completely ludicrous. Okay, and it's contradicted directly by the facts themselves. So that this quest for full spectrum dominance that they're engaged in, what I'm really saying is that there's this struggle going on, and I'm going to touch briefly upon its deeper history, very briefly here today, but we'll emphasize in the course focusing on after the end of World War I in 1918. But what I want to point out is I don't want you to think that all of a sudden it just sprang into being, at the end of World War I, because this thing actually started all the way back with the founding of the country. And you'll get a look at this, and that is that there were two basic factions that were operative at the founding of the United States Constitution, and one of them were the Federalists that you've heard about. And the Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was an attorney, extraordinarily bright, very ambitious, and very effective. And he represented a lot of the major banks in financial houses and industrialists, manufacturers. He was the lawyer for them. And he plied his trade to get them empowered by having a major new federal government set up. Because prior to that time, there were the 13 colonies. And this all you know, there were the 13 colonies. And the business people and the bankers and the financiers were distressed over the fact that each of the 13 colonies had its own currency. They had different weights and measures for commodities. And so that this mercantile group started lobbying like mad with the Continental Congress, where the representatives from the 13 colonies came and sat together basically as equals under the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation were drawn up after the victory in the American Revolutionary War, predicated upon the form of collective decision-making that had been adopted by the 5 Indian nations, the Iroquois Confederacy, that there were 5 Native American tribes up in northern New England, actually in northern New York, up along the Canadian border of the St. Lawrence River, the Mohawks and the Iroquois and the Onondaga and the Seneca, and that they were up in that territory. And they had decided, like 1,000 years ago, that it was really foolish for them to be fighting with each other. And so what they did is they had an agreement that if any kind of a disagreement arose between 2 of the tribes or the tribal members, that the medicine men of each of the 5 tribes would come together and they would participate in a sweat, which was this sweat lodge, this like igloo type structure, in which they would come in and they would all sit in a circle inside this igloo, and there was a hole in the ground where these superheated red rocks would be rolled in and put into the center, and the leader of the ceremony, the sweat ceremony, would throw water onto the rocks, and it would generate this intense steam that would fill up the sweat lodge, and it was an ordeal of pain, actually, for these medicine people, and that they would actually though it does, you won't find this in any of your contacts as white people. Most of you are non-native Americans. You won't find out about this, but in the kind of sweat lodges any of you might ever get to participate in. But the way they do it with the medicine men is they would keep on bringing these hot rocks into the thing, throwing water on them until two of the medicine men passed out from pain. And then they would then they would open up the sweat lodge and let all the scalding hot steam out. And then one of them that passed out first would sing a song and chant and tell what his visions were when he was passed out. And then he'd be all done. And then the second one would chant what his visions were when he was passed out. And then in that particular case, the medicine man from the Mohawk tribe, the people of Flint, who was a member of the Wolf clan, selected by the women of the Turtle clan, that he would, in fact, weave the two visions together in a song. And it would tell them how to resolve the conflict between the two tribal members. And so that's how it was done. But they had this alliance they called Akwesasne, which was the Great White Roots of Peace. And this confederation they had of the 5 Indian nations, later became 6 Indian nations, but it was the 5 Indian Nation Confederacy, was visited by Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin. And they came to understand how this confederacy had been established, and they used that as the model for the 13 colonies. So they had articles of confederation among the 13 colonies, all of which were equal, and they would come together, and then they would try to resolve their differences in what was called the Continental Congress. Now, because the 13 colonies each kept their own separate currency and their own system of weights and measures and other things, the bankers and the mercantilists and the manufacturers were trying to get some sort of common set of agreements to govern commerce. And so they started lobbying to set up a stronger, more centralized government that could have the power to do things like have a central bank with a central currency for all of them, and an agreement on central weights and measures, et cetera, and rules and regulations governing commerce primarily. These people perceived everything through the commercial lens. Everything had to do with mercantilism and business. And there was another element, however, inside the colonies that was led by, in its actuality, by James Madison. James Madison and Aaron Burr. And these two men, along with Thomas Jefferson, were in fact what is referred to in John Rawls, the chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University, has written a book called A Theory of Justice. It's a profound and important book for all philosophy students to study. He undertook a study of the theory of justice in Western civilization, and he thought that in a popular democracy, when a community is confronted with a particular public policy challenge or problem, that the likelihood is, in a democratic society, that they would choose the option that generated the greatest good for the greatest number. But what he actually discovered when was it that I first read that? It was 1973 when he published it. What he actually discovered is that if that were true, then why is it in the United States that the white people that were the clear majority didn't still own the black people? Because that was actually a majoritarian, utilitarian benefit for them, and yet they didn't do that. And he said that the reason they didn't is because the simple majoritarian, utilitarian mode of ethical reasoning in the democracy had been tempered by a group they called the intuitionists. And these intuitionists such as James Madison and Aaron Burr and others. Turns out they had all been schooled at the College of New Jersey, which later went on to be renamed Princeton University. That these people were instructed by a man by the name of John Witherspoon. And this is something that you could spend another 20 years in college and nobody's going to tell you. But it's important for you to understand this, is that John Witherspoon at the College of New Jersey between 1768 and 1794, some almost 30 years, taught all of these people a system of moral philosophy that was rooted in natural law. Now you have heard mention of the fact that it was a natural law theory that undergirds the Constitution of the United States. When the Constitution says such thing as all men are created equal, they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that they're natural law rights that inure to a person as a human being, they're essential elements of our humanity. All of this talk is having to do with natural law. And natural law was taught at the College of New Jersey by John Witherspoon, and he taught not only James Madison and Aaron Burr and William Bradford, who was the original governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but he actually taught over the years 37 federal judges, 3 of whom became United States Supreme Court justices. He taught 10 cabinet members. He taught 21 United States senators and 39 U.S. congressmen during his years. And he taught them all this theory of natural law. And we'll have some discussions about that as the weeks go forward so that we get a clearer understanding of what the mode of ethical reasoning is that was deployed by the people who are the intuitionists or the natural law advocates. But these people are in direct confrontation with these federalists that were openly advocating that all voting in the federal government be restricted to white male property owners, and that they believed in a theory of elitism, that the industrialists and the business people were better educated, they were from better families, they were driven by business and self-interest, but the fact of the matter is they believed that they should have the right to govern. And these other people, the intuitionists, the Madisonians, believed that people, men and women together, in non-property owners, had a right to participate in their own decision-making. And so there was this tension that took place right at the founding of the United States Constitution. And the Federalists, the Hamiltonians, managed to get put into the Constitution the fact, for example, and many of you probably don't know this yet, but that citizens were not allowed to vote for the senators at all. That you were allowed to, the decision as to whether you were going to get to vote at all was made by your state. And they're the ones that required you being white male property owners. And that you could vote for your congressional representative. And that's all. And then the state legislature would choose who was going to be the senator from the state. And you could not vote for the president. You could only vote for a certain person to go to participate in the Electoral College. You would select one of these well-heeled individuals to go to participate in Washington in the Electoral College to decide who they wanted the president to be. But that's all that you could do. And that was enshrined. All of those things were enshrined in the Constitution that was ratified in 1789. Now, the intuitionists or the Madisonians were insisting, however, that there be a Bill of Rights. put into the Constitution that would announce the fundamental natural law theory that is undergirding the Constitution. And they insisted upon these rights in the Constitution, and you're very familiar with these: the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment right of free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. These are things that are put in the Second Amendment, which is, there's some debate about, as you know, that a well-regulated militia being necessary for the maintenance of a free nation, that the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. And then they go down through the other famous amendments. The Fourth Amendment, the rights became the rights of privacy, that you have the right not to have your house searched or your papers or effects searched by the state without a warrant issued on probable cause, etc. There's a whole panoply of these. But very importantly, there is in the Bill of Rights, again, something that you might not hear much about, but when you get through all of these Bill of Rights, there is a Ninth Amendment. And the Ninth Amendment says that the enumeration in this Constitution of certain specific rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage the existence of others which are retained by the people. So the entire premise was that there are a panoply of natural law rights that an individual has over and against the collective and over and against the state. And then it says in the 10th Amendment, it says the powers not specifically delegated to the United States by this Constitution, nor expressly prohibited by it to the states, are reserved respectively to the people or the states. Okay? What they mean is that the people are represented by the states at the time, but the people are the ones who reserve these rights to themselves, and it is by dint of natural law that people possess these rights. So that right from the very, very beginning of the founding of the Constitution, you had these two elements, these Hamiltonian elitists who believed in the white supremacy, the mastery of the males over the females, the right of property owners over non-property owners, the right of an elite educated to rule, and to have all the decisions being basically prisoned through commerce and business profits. Basically, what's good for business is good for the community. Okay? And on the other hand, you had these intuitionists who believed that the government that governs least governs best, and the individuals ought to be left to their own devices to be happy, and that they should be allowed to have a fair share of whatever products are developed through labor of people, that the people who participate in giving their labor to the development of these different products, agrarian products and others, ought to have a fair share in these. Now, what we're going to be talking about during the course of the rest of the lectures and courses is that this social democratic movement that arose in the United States, confronting the elitists, the federalists, this other intuitionist group was known as the Democratic Republicans. That was what they were known as, the Democratic Republicans versus the Federalists. Now, some people have referred to them as the Anti-Federalists, but their actual literal name was the Democratic Republicans, and they are often referred to as the Jeffersonians, but they're actually the Madisonians. It was James Madison that was the principal author of the Constitution. He had drafted the Virginia Constitution. He was the major drafter of the Constitution itself. And what we're going to point out is that this confrontation, this dialectical contest between these two elements has been going on ever since the founding of the country. And there were a series of issues over which they clashed, and I'll touch on those briefly. But the point that I'm going to be making in the course, and I want us to all understand this, and you feel free to critique it and do research on your own to determine whether you believe this is true. And there are writings that are set forth, at least in the original of this much larger syllabus that we had. I had like about a 25-page syllabus, but my TAs beat up on me and said, you can't do that. And I was just saying, look, these are just for reference. You can read all these things. I wanted to make sure you knew where both sides of the arguments were on this. They said, no, it's got to be more streamlined and a little easier for the folks. And I said, fine. But for any of you who want the other syllabus, you'll get an extra point. No, I won't say that. I won't say you get an extra point. But anyway, but anybody who wants to see the other syllabus, you can contact me and I'll make it available. And you can have it so that you can link into all of these other potential readings that we have on this. But the thesis that I want to point out, and I want to bring it up to this time, at least in this lecture, and that is that this entire confrontation that was going on from the founding of the Constitution played itself out in a confrontation between the Federalists on the one side and the Democratic Republicans on the other side over such things as the demand on the part of the Federalists to have a national bank, a U.S. government bank. And there was a huge fight over that. And the Federalists wanted to have the federal bank, and they wanted to have the federal bank be able to create money by if they had, say, well, if they had $1 million on deposit, they wanted to be able to lend the portions of the money out to people and gain interest on the money and put it into the bank, and they were authorized to be able to lend more money than they actually had, because the people that they loaned the money to weren't going to be spending it all at one time, and they're going to be paying interest, etc. So they were able to multiply money. There's a whole long discussion about a fractional banking that we'll talk about a little bit later. But that was one of the major confrontations. Another one was the expansion, that the Federalists wanted to expand their territory. They were the major champions of manifest destiny. They wanted to go and take the land away from the Native American people. They wanted to be able to build rail lines out there. They wanted to have mining interests, a far-flung mining interests in the native territories, etc. And the Democratic Republicans didn't want that. They thought that diminished the value of their representation as states. And there were a series of confrontations that went on between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans that went on through the years. But it basically came to a head in the American Civil War. And it wasn't at all exclusively over slavery. It was over the relative authority of the states to make decisions. And the Federalists kept on drawing more and more authority into the central federal government to be able to make decisions that were beneficial primarily to the financial interests in the country. And they were continuing to do this, and the Democratic Republicans were resisting them. And it finally came to a head because the Northern industrialists wanted to prohibit having any type of slavery extend into any of the Western territories. They wanted to have workers in there. They wanted to have workers that they could employ for next to nothing, and they didn't have to house them. They didn't have to feed them. They could pay them the absolute minimal amounts and extract the maximum amount of work from them. And the Southerners who were opposing expansion in its entirety said that if you're going to expand, we have to be able to move some of and increase our agricultural holdings there, and we have a right to utilize the slaves that we have to do that. Now, that can become a touchy subject, because you certainly can't consider those type of people to be heroes in any way of championing the right to bring their slaves into the Western territories. But it was really just a particular form that the argument took over the argument about the comparative authority of the states vis-a-vis these elite industrialists. Okay, and so that when the war ended and the northern industrialists and financiers won the Civil War, they went right to it, starting in 1868. And as I mentioned, they started putting their corporate lawyers, their big business lawyers, into the courts. They established the doctrine of the corporation being a person. This person had fundamental constitutional rights that prohibited any of the government from regulating them or restricting their rights to engage in contract, etc. And so they rose to the ascendancy. And that the most important single thing that those rulings did was they completely immunized the owners of the stock from any personal liability of anything that the corporation did. And so right from the beginning, these corporations were just their assets that were in the bank owned by that corporation is all that was subject to liability for anything that the corporation did. And a stockholder could own 60% of all the profits and 60% of all of the resources of the corporation, but they were totally immunized against any liability. So if that corporation decided to pump poison out of their factory, say a leather factory or a tannery or something like that, into the river and poison all the fish and poison all the farmland, that there was no cause of action against the owners of the stock. They would just sit back and get the profits, but they had no liability. The management of the corporation had no personal liability. The boards of directors had no personal liability. It was just the corporation itself, that person. And it was just the assets of that person that were subject to judgments. And that was a disastrous formula. Because when you put together a business vehicle like that, the management are being driven by the effort to maximize the profits so that they can increase the shares that are being paid out, the profits to the shareholders. So you've designed a fundamental sort of sinful structure of the private shareholder-owned business corporation. And true to its nature, those corporations began to wreak havoc on the country. That they monopolized entire areas where they would go into a community and they would completely crush any of the competition in there. If you had a small farm and you were wanting to sell your grain, for example, they would come in and they would insist upon buying your land. If you wouldn't sell your land, what they would do is they would send Pinkertons actually to burn your crops down. They thought that was more or less fair because they viewed themselves as being in a war with any of their competitors, and they would buy them out or they would burn them out. They would go to the banks and refuse to give any loans to the other farmers, so they couldn't buy seed grain. They couldn't buy any kind of horses or plows or stuff for their food, and they would engage in all of these types of activities that became characteristic of the robber baron era. And this issue of expansion, this doctrine of manifest destiny, they kept insisting that this elite, these white elite males that were better educated and came from better families, who had a right to govern, they had a right to engage in this quest of taking control of the entire landmass of North America. In that they could throw out all the native people, kill the native people, put out bounties on the native people, scalp. In fact, the tradition of scalping started with them, that they had to produce the scalp of a native person in order to get the $100 reward for killing one of the native people. So there was a conscious program of attempting to exterminate the native people to take their land so you could get at their resources. Okay, so this doctrine of manifest destiny was driving the Federalist doctrines throughout this period. And what I'm going to be pointing out to you during the course is that this struggle between the elite landed aristocracy, the white male-dominated corporate aristocracy, that the battlefield on which this played itself out ended up being oil. Because at the end of World War I, as we're going to talk about here in a minute, that there was this thing started happening, that the robber barons that had risen to power between 1868 and 1898, by the time they got to 1900, they were poised to basically, they had control of the United States military. They could, for example, in 1903, they got the United States government to send a foreign military expeditionary force into Nicaragua to overthrow the democratically elected government in Nicaragua on behalf of United Fruit. United Fruit wanted to be able to grow bananas and things down in Nicaragua, and they didn't want to have to pay any taxes. And so when the government there tried to tax them for that, they brought in the military. United States Marines went in, an expeditionary force under General Smedley Butler actually led that particular operation. And they did it repeatedly. Time after time after time, they would intervene. They went in and intervened and took over Panama to build the canal for commerce so that they could save money by not having to go around the Horn. And they would come through that was all done by the United States government. Everything was being done for the benefit of the corporations, okay? And this rampant national imperialism that the United States was engaged in was also being engaged in by other countries in Europe, which of course led to the First World War, is the fundamental clash between Germany and France and England and the other countries. But what I want to do today, in the time that we have, is I want to just point out that this effort to impeach Trump, that Trump is the absolute paradigmatic example of a robber baron, who cheats and lies and connives and tries to monopolize and dominate everybody. And the fact that he has risen to the head of the Republican Party, which is the progeny of the Federalists, is not at all coincidental. Is completely consistent with the history of the entire Federalist Party. Okay, and that my objective today is to really get you to understand the deeper understanding of what's going on behind the impeachment, because the effort to get him impeached, as distinct from getting him unelected in 2020, this effort that is being led by people, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or the effort to get him impeached is an attempt to impeach the concept of the robber barons, is to impeach that idea, to try to purge that idea from the body politic. Not just to say, well, you got your arguments and we've got ours, and we'll go in, we'll have an election, and if you win, we'll lay back and let you rape and pillage and destroy the environment, destroy the planet. Because, well, you won in a kind of a fair fight. And unless we can prove that the fight was unfair, like that you brought in Russia to try to help you, unless we can prove that overwhelmingly, we're just going to leave you in. That's Nancy Pelosi, that's Chuck Schumer, that's the new, more moderate Democratic Party. That's their position. But there is a justice Democratic movement inside the Democratic Party and outside the Democratic Party and the Green Party and others to impeach him, to expunge the legitimacy of this type of conduct from the body politic. Not to have it just be considered one of the two positions, and it's sometimes worse and sometimes less worse, but we know what it is and it's always here. This effort to get rid of it, to purge it from our culture, is what is motivating the impeachment movement. And that we're going to be talking about that as we go on. Now, what I want to point out here is that there are certain elements of the robber baron era that are being replayed right now, and I want to point out that while this phenomenon has been going on since the founding of the country and went on all the way between 1889 and the founding of the Constitution, 1891, the passage of the Bill of Rights, all the way on up through to 1864 in this American Civil War. And it became intensified after the war between 1868 and 1898 during the robber baron era. It was at play. The clash of imperial powers were at play in World War I. And at the very end of World War I, where we start here in the closing portions of this lecture, is at the end of World War I, the Allied powers that's the United States that came in France, and Britain it came in. The United States came in against Germany. And remember, Germany was allied not with Japan, which was the Second World War, but in the First World War, they were allied with Turkey, which was the Persian Empire. And so Germany and Turkey were the opponent in World War I. And when they were vanquished at the end of World War I, the Allied powers established a commission, and it was chaired by Winston Churchill from the United Kingdom. He was, in fact, the Minister for Colonial Affairs of the United Kingdom. They put together a 22-person commission, 21 men and 1 woman, and they imposed artificial boundaries over the entire Middle East. And they superimposed the nation-state system that had been adopted in Europe by the Treaty of Westphalia in, I think, 1647 or so. And the concept of the nation-state had been decided upon by the royal families in Europe. That, look, let's stop having all these fights over the boundaries and who has what rights. Let's have clear national boundaries. Let's have a nation-state entity, and the royal family will rule over that nation-state. And we'll have rules of engagement, etc. And what they did in 1922, after the end of the war, what they did is this commission superimposed these boundaries, these nation-state boundaries, on the Middle East. And that's why you have these peculiar, they look like boxes with these straight lines, and they've got Lebanon and Yemen and Libya and Egypt and Saudi Arabia. They've got all of these areas all carved up. And what they did is this commission handpicked one of the tribes. This was a tribal territory. These are Aboriginal indigenous people that lived throughout this area of the world, but they were subject to the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire. And so when Turkey and the Persian Empire lost World War I, the Western powers came in, took control of those areas, superimposed these artificial boundaries, and then they handpicked one of the tribes inside that geophysical area and made them the king. The head of the family was made the king. And then what they did is they put them in power, and they provided military equipment to them and funding to them to establish hegemony over that physical territory. But very importantly, what they did is they dispatched, at the end of World War I, Kermit Roosevelt, who was the nephew of Theodore Roosevelt. He was assigned to go and search throughout the area to determine whether oil existed. And what they did is they assigned the protectorate among the Allies were in charge of the oil development inside that particular nation state. And so what they would do is that particular nation, the Western Allied power, would establish a private oil corporation. Royal Dutch Shell, for example. The United States had the Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of California. They had Exxon. They had British Petroleum. There were 7 major oil corporations that they named themselves collectively the Arab American Oil Corporation, the Aramco. And these 7 oil corporations, they engaged in negotiations with the royal family that they had designated, and they agreed that they would have an exclusive 60-year lease that would run from approximately 1922 to 1982. And that this exclusive lease agreement would authorize the oil corporation that had been created by that allied nation state to develop that oil. And what they would do is they would agree to pay the royal family, not the country, not the national treasury of the country, but the royal family privately. They would pay them anywhere from 6 to 10% of the profits for the development of that oil. And 90% to 94% of all of the profits would be kept by the Allied Oil Corporation, the Allied Nation Oil Corporation. And so the royal families got filthy rich, even on 6 to 10% of the income. But what happened is there's a book called The Prize. And I should have written down to know who the author of The Prize is. Somebody can look it up on your thing here. But there's a book called The Prize, and it's like about a 700-page book. You're not going to have to read the whole thing, probably half of it. No, you won't have to read half of it either. But there's a book called The Prize, and it tracks this history. You found it? Yes, Daniel Yergin. Y-U-G-A-N. Y-U-R-G-A-N. Y-E-R-G-I-N. Look at that. You should have a copy of this book. Whether you get it on Kindle or whatever you want to do. But it's just that part of during your undergraduate years and then going on into your graduate school years, you'll start to assemble a certain number of key books that you'll want to have. Many times in the course I just start assigning a few pages out of each one, so you'll have to get it. But I'm just going to recommend it to you that you should get a copy of this book, The Prize, Daniel Yergin's book. It's just like Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. You should have that. Because you go to chapter 11 in Howard Zinn's book, The People's History of the United States, and it'll tell you all about the robber baron era. It'll talk all about that stuff. And he'll also talk about this confrontation that went on between who he refers to as the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians at the beginning of the founding of the country. So there's a couple key books like this, and when I hit onto one of these, I'll tell you about it. And there'll be a few others as we go through the course. But what I'm saying is that this event that took place at the end of World War I, in addition to sending out this Kermit Roosevelt to identify where all these oil fields were and to have the deals made by the Allied countries' oil corporations with the royal family that was appointed by them to govern inside those areas. A second thing happened, and that is that at the end of World War I, the Russian people rose up, as you know. They rose up against Tsar Nicholas II, and they overthrew him as the royalty. It was like the royal family of Russia. It was like the French Revolution, that rose up against the French royalists, earlier. and they threw out the czar. They established a people's republic, and originally it was fueled by an extremely idealistic vision of having a people's republic that participated in an egalitarian way in a democratic process that eventually fell prone to being taken over by Stalin and became an authoritarian, centralized authoritarian government. But at the end of World War I, when they threw out Tsar Nicholas, they had this whole period where they had this real idealistic revolutionary process going on, and they declared that their resources inside their territory of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics were not going to be available to the capitalists and the corporate capitalists in the oil industry and the people in the West. And they didn't declare war on them. What they did is they said, we're withdrawing Russia from World War I as an ally of the Allies, and we're withdrawing. We're stopping fighting in the war. We're going to set up the Soviet Socialist Republic, and we're going to have this idealistic self-governing process and lay claim to our own resources. Well, what happened is the United States government, the Secretary of State, Robert, I hadn't thought about this for a while. I should have made a note about it. But Robert Lansing. Robert Lansing was the Secretary of State for Wilson, President Wilson, at the end of World War I. Wilson had had a stroke and was incapacitated, actually. And Robert Lansing had risen up to basically start asserting a lot of the powers of the presidency. And he sent a foreign military expeditionary force into Russia to try to crush the Bolshevik Revolution, allied with what they call the White Russians, who are the European Russians around St. Petersburg, in that whole far western section of Russia, that they joined together with the United States military forces and attempted to crush the Bolshevik Revolution. But the Bolsheviks repelled them, so that this antagonism between the people of Russia in the Soviet Socialist Republic actually began with a United States military invasion of Russia in an attempt to crush them, which they don't tell you about. They don't tell you about it, even in most of your high school civics classes. You can actually take courses at the college level, and they don't tell you about that. And why is that? Because they view it as unpatriotic. Because they somehow view the effort on the part of the government to overthrow the Bolshevik Revolution as somehow having been kind of a patriotic endeavor. But when you found out that Robert Lansing is in fact the son-in-law of John W. Foster, who was the Secretary of State back in 1893 when they moved in, took over the Philippine Islands, took over Hawaii, took over Guam. They were moving out into the Pacific Ocean in this full manifest destiny imperialist venture that they were engaged in. And it turns out that John W. Foster is the grandfather of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles having become the first civilian head of the American Central Intelligence Agency in 1952. And John Foster Dulles becoming the Secretary of State. Okay, and what you've got is this elite group of people and families still governing, and they actually utilize the tools of the American government to generate this invasion into Russia to try to crush the Bolshevik Revolution in the cradle. Just like they had sent foreign military expeditionary forces into Nicaragua, into El Salvador, into like 18 different places that they had sent U.S. military forces, all at the behest of the robber barons, to basically secure resources for them to be able to profit through their corporations. And so that this period that went on, it got worse than that, because what happened is that the same people that you're going to find, and we'll revisit this a number of times in the course, that these robber barons organized themselves into a private investment house that was named Brown Brothers Harriman. And it was a big Wall Street private investment firm where there were approximately 50 investors. They included people like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan of the Morgan Guarantee Trust, the DuPonts were there. I said all the Rockefellers were there with all the oil, and the Chase Bank. That there were about 50 of these families, 40 to 50 of these families. And what they would do is they would all sit on each other's boards of directors. So they had this interlocking set of directors for these different corporations, and they would coordinate their activities together. So that for example, that the railways and the steamships and the cargo ships, would all coordinate with carrying the coal or carrying the oil or carrying the grains, and they were divvying up the natural resources of the country among themselves. And they did this through their law firm. The name of the law firm was Sullivan and Cromwell. And there's another book that you might want to get, and it's called A Law Unto Themselves, or A Law Unto Itself. And it is the secret history of Sullivan and Cromwell. And again, you can find the name of the author there. I'm just sort of realizing it as I'm telling you about all this, as you should probably see that, because it's extraordinarily clear about what it is that they were doing. That these 50 families were just basically running the country, and they were more or less unabashed about it. And that what they did at the end of World War II, or World War I rather, in 1924, the person who was the CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman was a man by the name of George Herbert Walker. And the reason that sounds a bit familiar to you is because he's the grandfather of George Herbert Walker Bush, George H.W. Bush Sr. And he's the great-grandfather of George W. Bush, which is that's who he is. And this fellow, George Herbert Walker, and that's W. Bush, is W for Walker. Okay? And George Herbert Walker, he retired as the CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman. I did this quickly in the first lecture, but he went and set up a Union Bank of New York and got the 50 families that were investors in the Brown Brothers Harriman investment house, and they capitalized this bank. And then they set up a foreign subsidiary of the Union Bank of New York up in the Netherlands called the Bank of Shipping and Commerce. And a guy named Fritz Thyssen ran that bank for them. And they financed the entire rise of the Third Reich Nazi Party in Germany. And they built the headquarters. It's all verifiable that they built the headquarters of the Third Reich. And they financed the rise of them as a bulwark against Bolshevism. And they kept using the term Bolshevism to refer to socialism. That the people in the Union of Soviet Republics, they, in fact, were trying to establish a socialist government run by the people all the way up until about 1924. And in 1924, Joseph Stalin rose to power and started transforming that whole experiment into a major authoritarian, centralized power to protect themselves as they said, against the constant efforts on the part of the Western allies to penetrate into them and get access to their resources. And so this began a dialectical conflict going on between the Bolsheviks, now the Stalinists in Russia, against the Allied powers. And this is that famous Cold War that went on for some 75 years, basically, all the way from 1917 with the October Revolution, all the way up until December 31st of 1991, when Gorbachev signed the edict releasing all of the republics from the USSR. Now, this period is an extraordinarily important period of history to understand. But prior to the Cold War, this whole interregnum period between 1868 and the rise of the robber barons, the generation of World War I, and then this whole period following World War I that goes from about 1918 all the way to the beginning of World War I in 1941. Okay, well, actually 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. Okay, but now this is a history, and the only reason that I raise it, and you can have some questions in a minute here, but the reason I raise it is because it's all background to what it is that's going on now. That this conflict that you see happening now is a continuation of this same dialectic that it was going on between the Hamiltonians and the Madisonians. It was later going on between the robber barons and a group that I want you to get a look at. This is a very important piece that, again, you're almost never told about this. But during the height of the rise of the robber barons, from 1868 to 1898, in about 1874, 75, the United Board of Homeland Ministries of the United Methodist Church decided that what the robber barons were doing was not only unethical, it was unchristian. It was contrary to the basic values of Judeo-Christian social teaching. And so that what they did is they decided they were going to up at their summer resort they had up at Lake Chautauqua, up in northern New York, out by Niagara Falls, they were going to invite everyone who wanted to be a Sunday school teacher for the Methodist Church to come with their spouse and their families for free up to Chautauqua, New York, and spend the summer there at their big summer resort on the lake and learn about why what the robber barons were doing were unchristian and violative of the social ethics of the Judeo-Christian community. And that went on from 1874 to about 1879 for several years. And then they realized that wasn't going to be fast enough. And so what they did, in 1879, they issued an invitation to all high school civics teachers throughout the country to come with their spouse and family up to Chautauqua, New York. And what happened is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people came all the way across the country to Lake Chautauqua and flooded the whole place. And they didn't have enough rooms for them. They didn't have enough living space. And so they all started fanning out and living in homes all around. The people all put them up. And they had this huge, gigantic thing that was basically like Woodstock that you've heard about, which is all part of history, I guess, for you guys. But Woodstock was this gigantic, as you know, big musical celebration where thousands of young people came from all around the country up to Woodstock in Massachusetts. And New York is all the way to Woodstock, New York. And for those who were there, right, actually I drove right past it and didn't even know what was going on. I mean, I was at Harvard Law School. I was driving home all the way up to Lake George, New York, and I said, what are all these cars doing here? There was like tons of these cars. I could hear this music going. But anyway, but this thing that happened in 1879, 1880, that all these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people came to Lake Chautauqua, and they started getting trained in understanding what was unethical about what the robber barons were doing. And then they fanned out and went out into the country, into the schools. And then the next year they had regional meetings that all got overwhelmed with more high school teachers. And then it went on. And by the year 1920, there were over 2,000 Chautauqua sessions held in the United States that summer. And the Chautauqua movement became the point of the spear, if you will, of the entire intuitionist movement, that entire Madisonian movement to try to counter the Federalists and the Hamiltonians and the robber barons. And it's an extraordinarily important movement in history, and it gave rise to the women's suffrage movement that generated the 19th Amendment in 1919. It generated the anti-child labor statutes, prohibiting 7, 8-year-old kids working in the mines 18 hours a day in the factories, etc. It generated the American labor movement. Actually originated unions and also originated the public school system. Dewey, John Dewey was recommending the free public education for people. Very similar, like free college education they're talking about now, right, in the state schools. Bernie Sanders and the AOC and the rest of the people are talking about it. That what you're seeing here is a potential revision of the Chautauqua movement against the robber barons, represented by Donald Trump and Rex Tillerson and all of these people who are the masters of the oil industry, because it's, as you'll see in the prize, that the oil was the engine of the military and industrial power of this element in the country. And so that their ownership and control of the oil and the monopoly control of the oil, and they of course, what we're going to get to in the course is that the entire thing going on in the Middle East right now, the whole thing is all because George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, the grandson of George Herbert Walker of Brown Brothers Harriman, invaded and occupied the Middle Eastern oil fields at the end of the Cold War. And that's what all of this is that's going on right now. Okay, so we'll unpack that for you, trying to understand what's going on in our world right now with the wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan and Iraq and now in other countries as well, and the effort to impeach Trump and this division in the Democratic Party between the genuine progressives and the more moderates. All of this stuff is going to be the warp and the woof of this course that we're going to be talking about over this time. Okay, but so what we're going to do Thursday is we're going to review the Mueller report to see what the basic information is that has been made available to the Congress, to the intuitionists, to the college students, to the universities. And what you'll see is it's almost nowhere in the academy, in the universities around the country, are they likely to be studying the Mueller report. But you're going to get to do it. So we're going to get to see what the ammunition is that the intuitionists have to be able to mount against the robber barons in their resurgence here at the end of the Cold War. Okay? Well, no, just the kids. We could talk after. But I ran up against the line. But I only do this in 99% of the time. Okay, but look, if you've got any pressing questions and you don't have to run off to your next class, you can come up and ask me. Yes.
There's 10 minutes left.
Oh, is it 10 minutes? Oh, good. Oh, good. See, fantastic. All right. So look, I know it's hard to, after getting dosed like this, to think of particular questions, but I would like to have you think of some questions because you should start thinking about your papers. You know, that all of this stuff is going to be pertinent to your papers because there's details of global climate change which are important, but the politics of global climate change are going to be relevant as well. Okay? So if you can think of any great questions, just the student, just the kids. Huh?
I said I know them. I thought you were...
Yeah, no. Yeah, you're right. No, that's okay.
So you spoke about the immunity that
Yes.
like shareholders, management any sort of pollution, like a BP oil spill or stuff like that, is there any sort of like legal tools for prosecution whatsoever in terms of either civil or criminal offenses?
The criminal potential liability, but civil, the whole civil immunity that they have is sort of across the board. That you cannot sue them. You do not have standing to sue them. The corporation is all that can be sued, and you go after their assets. With regard to criminal statutes,
There is like active decisions made with the knowledge that there could be like.
oh, not only could be, but there is.
Yeah.
That with full knowledge that it is killing people. You know, they did it with the car, the Chevy, the Corvair. You know, they knew perfectly well that it was killing people, and that, you know, if somebody bumps into the back of you, it was going to explode the gas tank and kill you. And they had clear computations as to, well, how many times is this going to happen? How much is it going to cost? How many of them are likely to try to sue us? How many of them can we crush with our lawyers to beat them up back, and we don't have to pay them anything, which they did, you know? And then when we do have to make a payoff, we can keep it secret. They don't know how much it got paid. We don't admit any kind of liability. And the entire civil system, drafted up by the lawyers that are all part of that whole elite, you know, protect them. You know, so the only way to break through is if there's criminal liability. If you can tell, and the problem with that is that most of the criminal statutes require what they call scienter, which is an actual evil intent, an intent to have your action cause the damage that it does. And they seek their defense by saying, well, I wasn't intending it for it to happen. You know, but then if they can get charged with reckless negligence, they say, oh, well, that's a civil standard. And you can't sue me civilly because I have civil immunity. And so that the only thing there is in there is reckless endangerment. It's like as if you're up on an overpass dropping rocks off on cars coming by. You aren't intending to kill anybody necessarily, but it's so reckless, it's reckless endangerment. And that's that area of criminal law that is reckless endangerment. The problem is that it has to be decided by prosecutors who are government officials. And the problem is the prosecutors are elected and their campaigns are paid for by a lot of the corporations. And so well, they might prosecute some teenagers for dropping rocks on cars going by. They don't prosecute the owners of the major corporations for raping and pillaging because then they won't get their campaign contributions. And it isn't just an individual thing. But my own, I'm the DA and I'm planning to run for the congressional seat, like they all do. Every prosecutor you ever meet thinks they're going to be president. You know, that's how they start out. You got to be a prosecutor. Like you have to go and fight in a war somewhere, wherever we're invading, and you got to get that military record. Then you become an assistant DA, and then the DA, and then you become president. You know, Kamala Harris, classic. You watch it. You know, and so the bottom line is that the Democratic Party and Republican Party that decide whether you're going to get the nomination to be the district attorney will tell you not to do the case. Don't prosecute the people in this corporation because they give the Republican Party contributions. And that's the problem with this. The thing has been poisoned at the base with money in the authority to bribe the Congress people and the legislators.
How do environmental regulations and executive actions kind of play into this?
Well, it's interesting. This is one of the important issues that you raise here, because in watching what's happening with Trump, over the years, the Democratic Party has tended to give a great deal of discretion to the executive branch to issue these executive orders. For example, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton issued an executive order back in 97. He issued an executive order in 1997 stating that it was a violation of the Federal Civil Rights Act for an oil corporation or any other corporation that's going to be building a noxious infrastructure, such as a waste disposal place, to place that in or near a racial minority community. Because they used to do that all the time. That's what they would do it all the time. And then they would say, oh, well, we didn't really do it because they were a racial minority. We did it because the land was cheaper there. Well, the land was cheaper there because it was in a racial minority community. And so that he issued an executive order mandating that, but it has limitations on it, is that he issued an order mandating that any company, any corporation that does business with the federal government is prohibited from building a noxious infrastructure in a racial community. Okay, so there's a limitation on who they can get at under those things, because that has to do with the limitations of the power of the federal government. Okay, because theoretically they don't exist just as a general government in the whole country. The whole idea was to set up a federal government to provide fill in the interstices for the financial and business community that they needed assistance with. And so that they've run over that considerably now. So that you set up an authority in the executive branch to issue benign executive orders to protect the environment, for example. And the problem is Trump comes in and says, let me see all those executive orders. There they are. There's about 100 of them protecting the environment. Let's get rid of all those. Let's just cancel those and then walk around bragging about how we're getting rid of all of these cumbersome regulations, freeing up business. Like he just did. He just issued 2 executive orders last week, specifically prohibiting states from negating the authority of an oil pipeline corporation to build a pipeline through their state. And say, well, if they filed the application for the permit and 60 days has expired and the state has not given them the permit, the president can intervene and order them to give them the permit. That was his executive order. Now, the fact that it is transparently illegal, it doesn't bother him at all, because he thinks he's got the courts. And he's got all those lawyers now, all these corporate lawyers that they're appointing now under the Federalist Society to stand on their head, to do anything they can do to contrive some type of an argument to let him get away with this. And that's what they do. You know, there's like they've now, by the time they got to the United States Supreme Court, they allowed him to ban basically Muslim people from coming to the country, even though they struck down the first 2 iterations of it. You know, and he finally, what he's doing is he's packing all the courts. He's packing all the courts now. But remember, the Federalists, in creating the Constitution, gave the authority to the president to nominate federal judges. So they know perfectly well that there's a political consideration, a worldview consideration in selecting the judges. So that this myth that the judges are all completely neutral and they're only governed by the law has never been true. Has never been true. So I'll close with this one, and it's one little aphorism that I've said before, that when we're talking about our country and the condition we're in today, is remember the old Irish aphorism. The Irish refer to Ireland as the old sod, and there's an old aphorism that says, well, the old sod isn't what it used to be, but then it never was. Okay, so things seem pretty awful right now with this kind of blatant confrontation between these morons who say all this kind of stuff just out of avarice and greed, but they've been there ever since the beginning, you know? And so we're in constant struggle with them to try to get them under control. And now the impeachment movement is to try to get rid of them entirely, to condemn them, to strike them from the office for doing what they're doing. And the great advantage is that we have an absolute paradigmatic example of a robber baron in the office. There he is. He's a pure model of everything that they stand for. And that's why the Republicans are so afraid. You know, they can't disown him because he represents everything that they stand for. You know, so we have to, and that's why the regular, more moderate Democrats don't want to lose their adversary, so they can keep control within the Republicans and Democrats of running the country. You know, and so there's this, and now the whole third movement, this Justice Democrat movement of AOC and the others, is inside the Democratic Party. They made a tactical decision not to go out into the Green Party and challenge them, but to take advantage of taking control of the Democratic Party. And that's what's going on right now, is that your generation is in the process of trying to take control of the Democratic Party and have it be a justice party. And so that's what this course is going to be monitoring. So we'll take a look Thursday to see what kind of ammunition we've got for the impeachment. Okay? Great, kids. There you go. Yeah. See you. Well, I'll talk to you. Okay?